This is an unofficial, fan-made audiobook. All original stories are owned by Wizards of the Coast. If you are enjoying these stories, please consider subscribing to my Patreon over at patreon.com/voxoraculum for some special patron-exclusive content. Thanks. On with the story.
Kaito's chest felt bruised. He'd really thought the Emperor might be in Jukai Forest, and that hearing Kyodai's voice was a sign she had finally found her way home. But the Tanuki Kami standing in the grass wasn't the friend he'd lost, and it certainly wasn't the ancient Kami from the temple. The creature released another layered call, quieter this time. With Tameshi's staff still in his hands, Kaito slowly sank to his knees, eyes never leaving the Kami's glowing face. Tameshi said it was the embodiment of the Emperor's bond with Kyodai. If that was the case, was there a part of her still here? Would the Kami, recognize Kaito? He'd set the weapon on the ground and pressed a hand to his chest. "I mean you no harm." He'd come to Jukai Forest for Tameshi's research, but now that he knew what it could lead to, and what the Kami represented, a knot formed in his throat. He had to keep the Kami safe. Leaves fluttered behind him, and a dark object burst from the tree line, metal body glittering beneath the sun. It hovered in circles above Kaito before making a slow descent. When it landed on the ground beside the Kami, they were nearly identical in build. The difference was that while one was clearly a robot, the other was as dazzling as starlight, with multiple golden orbs spinning carefully around its body. They were like the spheres that ran along Kyodai's back, only a great deal smaller. The robot beeped. The Kami released a layered greeting. Aiko and Tameshi appeared on the hill. When their eyes fell on the Kami, Aiko's gasp was audible. She slowly made her way to Kaito's side, hand clutched at the material near her neck. "Did it say anything?" Kaito shook his head. "Kyodai spoke to the Emperor telepathically. Maybe this Kami works the same way." He met Aiko's eyes. "We have to protect it." Aiko nodded like it was never a question. When she spotted the Tanuki robot, her face crumpled. She sucked in a breath before spinning to face Tameshi. "I was wondering how you were tracking my brother so easily. You didn't just build armor. You built a drone." Tameshi pressed his hands against the air. "We need to be able to locate the Kami if they get lost or hurt." "Drones have been weaponized with the right upgrades," Aiko argued. "Do you have any idea what the repercussions would be for something like that?" Kaito tried to imagine a Kamigawa where spirits ran around with armor and blades like miniature mechs. Spirits that could be controlled by people like Satoru. The thought was unsettling. "That isn't the purpose of my research," Tameshi said, firm. "The design isn't about controlling the Kami. It's about keeping them safe." "Safe from what?" Aiko demanded. Tameshi's jaw hardened. "From whatever is on the other side of the merge gates." Kaito and Aiko both fell silent. He wasn't just trying to study the Kami and the merge. He wanted to study what was on the other side. "You're trying to send Kami back to the spirit realm," Kaito clarified. "If I can find a way to connect Kami and drone, then eventually, yes." Tameshi sighed. "There is still so much we need to learn. And the knowledge is out there. We just need to be brave enough to find the key and open the door." "You don't care about the Kami. You're just trying to protect the information they could bring you if they could move between realms." Aiko clenched her teeth. "Your research threatens the balance of Kamigawa. It can't continue." Tameshi was stoic. We already have the ability to channel with the Kami. Is this really any different? A channeler has built a relationship with the Kami. There's trust and mutual respect. It's meant to be a gift. Aiko sounded exasperated. What you want to do is capture their power and give it to whoever the highest bidder is. No, Tameshi started, but Aiko wasn't finished. You might not intend for it to be a weapon, but it is. And if your research gets out, someday someone will use it to their advantage. Tameshi looked away, flustered. What I am trying to accomplish is not about greed. It's about understanding. The merge gates are proof that there is more to life than what we know. And to have that kind of knowledge, to lift the veil of the unknown, it may require sacrifices some are not willing to make. Aiko shook her head. Power requires balance. In the wrong hands, your knowledge could destroy the merge gates. It could destroy Kamigawa. Tameshi's gaze shuttered. You say that because you're too stubborn to look ahead to the future, of what Kamigawa will someday become, and the steps we need to take to make sure that future remains stable. His eyes flashed open. The Imperials will fail us all if they do not take bigger risks to study the merge. We're protecting the plane we have now. Aiko's voice didn't waver. Your research, it needs to be destroyed. At that, Tameshi's shoulders sank. I am so close. If I could just... The small Kami howled again, voice raised in warning. Kaito's instincts clamored in agreement with the Kami's distress. Something wasn't right. The forest had gone far too quiet, and there was an emptiness in the air, almost like... Kaito stiffened. The last time he'd felt this way was in Satoru's den. The grass rustled nearby, and Kaito spun to find Satoru's spies. 5 Hyozan reckoners, their belts littered with blades and their arms etched in colourful ink. The one in front was the woman with the needle-tipped gloves. Nari, the reckoner with an expertise in poisons, her hair scraped back into a high braid. And behind her was Satoru's channeler. Nari flashed her teeth. Satoru sends his regards. Kaito tried not to react when tendrils of black smoke poured from the channeler's skin, snapping at the air like vipers. I don't remember putting in a request for a babysitter, he said. Nari sniffed, flicking her claws at the air. Satoru always did wonder whether you were a spy. A former samurai is one thing, but an imperial student. She tutted. Hard to believe anyone would leave such pretty walls, unless they were ordered to. Sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not a spy. Kaito's fingers danced at his sides. His knife was tucked in his belt, and the staff was still in the grass. There was no chance of reaching either weapon before the reckoners retaliated. Satoru knows that. Why do you think he handpicked me for this job? Even her words were laced with poison. Probably the same reason he asked us to keep an eye on you. They'd been watching him. How did Kaito not realize? How did he not sense them? For a moment, he could hear Lightpaw's voice in his head, telling him he was too brazen and overconfident, that his ego was creating blind spots. Kaito tried not to scowl. Bluffing was the only card he had left. If you've been tailing me, you know I came here for the schematics, he said with a shrug. If you've been tailing me, you know I came here for the schematics, he said with a shrug. Even if they had been following Kaito, what could the Reckoners possibly have on him? Up until he came face to face with the Kami, he'd never intended to double-cross Satoru. Everything he'd done before that was to get a hold of Tameshi's research. The channeler lifted her grey face.
You know I channel Azumaki, treachery incarnate.
She didn't blink, but when the smoke formed into insect-like pincers that expanded from her spine, Kaito took several steps back.
Did you really think I wouldn't sense your betrayal?
One of the reckoners moved quickly, grabbing hold of Aiko and holding a sword against her neck. Kaito clenched his fists, face growing hot. If you hurt her... Nari waved a hand.
You sought out an Imperial to help you. An Imperial you knew would report us.
She lifted a thin brow.
It's all the proof Satoru will need to see you're a spy.
Kaito's mind desperately tried to piece together a plan. But all he had was a way to stall for time. Was this a setup from the beginning? He asked, determined to keep the conversation going as long as he could. Did Satoru even want the research?
Of course he did,
Nari replied.
Your loyalty may have been famed, but your talents were not. He hoped you'd lead us to Tameshi.
She flashed her canines.
And you did.
Kaito inhaled sharply when he heard the kami move behind him. He wasn't sure if the reckoners understood its significance, or if they knew quite how rare it truly was. But Kaito had understood the moment he heard its voice. He needed to get the reckoners far away from the kami. Kaito tried to draw their focus. The schematics aren't here. They're back at his camp. He turned to the moonfolk. If Tameshi really did want to protect the kami, this was the only option. Though Tameshi's face was ashen, he gave a curt nod like he understood more than Kaito did. I can take you there, he said to the Hyozan, but only if you let the others go. What are you doing? Kaito wanted to hiss. Tameshi was practically a stranger. He didn't owe Kaito anything. But he was trying to spare them from harm, in whatever small way he could. Nari laughed.
You're hardly in a position to be making deals.
Tameshi scowled. You'll never make sense of the research. Not without my help. So either let them go, or I am not telling you a thing. Nari stalked toward him and lifted Tameshi's chin with one hand, nails dangerously close to breaking skin.
You will.
She tilted her head and gestured to one of the other spies.
We don't need witnesses. And don't forget the kami.
She met Kaito's stricken gaze.
Something tells me we might need it.
Kaito snarled and was bending his knees to lunge for the nearest spy, when Aiko slammed her head back against her captor's face. As the reckoners growled in pain, Aiko pulled her sleeve up to reveal a hidden weapon. A metal coil unwound from her, the miniature blades connected by a glowing white light until they formed a sword. She gripped the hilt and swung for another reckoner's neck with impeccable speed. Kaito didn't have time to gape. He hurled himself at one of the reckoners and pinned him to the ground. Throwing several punches against the man's face, Kaito used the distraction to scramble for Tameshi's staff. He recovered it just in time to block a steel blade flying toward his chest. The reckoners became a whirlwind of steel and fury. Kaito fell back, blocking again and again, staving off as many of them as he could until he reached Aiko on the battlefield. What happened to no weapons? Kaito managed to shout as they fought back to back. Aiko grunted, kicking one of the assailants square in the chest.
This is diplomacy. When words fail, we use our blades.
Her sword met flesh, and as the man fell, she threw a look over her shoulder.
I told you no weapons because I knew you would do the exact opposite.
Several yards away, Tameshi landed beside the Kami. Kaito couldn't hear him over the frenzy of weapons, but he could tell by the way he was holding onto the robot that he was trying to get the Kami to merge with it. But the Kami refused. Kaito strained beneath Nari's sword. The only thing keeping her back was the metal staff between them. He grunted, shoved hard, and swung his weapon to meet hers. Kaito and his sister may have been trained by the most elite samurai on Kamigawa, but they were clearly outnumbered. With every clash of metal against metal, Kaito's fear flowed to the surface of his mind. If something happened to his sister, he'd never forgive himself. He knew she would watch over the Kami. She'd make sure Tameshi's research never fell into the wrong hands. She would do what's best for Kamigawa and the Emperor. If only one of them was going to make it out of this fight. He wanted it to be Aiko. "Take Tameshi and the Kami and run," Kaito hissed.
"Whatever you're planning, you can forget it," Aiko hissed back. "I'm not leaving you behind."
Kaito opened his mouth to argue, as a roar broke through the trees. The reckoners hesitated, only for a moment, and when Kaito looked up at the ridge, hope seeped back into his chest. The Order of Jukai had arrived. A woman with yellow flames in her hands stood at the edge of the hill. 7 glowing stones floated beside her, and she wore a helmet made of bone. All around her were at least a dozen more Kami channelers, clad in leather armor and ready for a fight. Nari released a guttural shout, and then chaos. The Order of Jukai met the reckoners in the clearing, and the once silent forest filled with battle cries. It was a whirlwind of black smoke and yellow flames. Kaito grabbed Aiko by the arm and tugged. "We need to go." Aiko's breathing was heavy.
"But the Order
are not going to be very happy with us if they win this fight," Kaito pointed out. "It isn't safe here. For any of us." He turned to look at the Tanuki Kami. Whatever happened, he needed to get the spirit out of the forest. Tameshi sent his drone for cover in the clouds. "I tried to explain, but she won't come with me." "She?" Kaito repeated, staring straight into the Kami's bright eyes. He knelt to meet her. "These people, they'll hurt you if they get the chance. I need to take you somewhere safe." The Tanuki stared back. Kaito took a breath and hoped the silence was an understanding between them. "Please don't bite me," he mouthed, and scooped the Kami up in his arms. When he ran, Aiko and Tameshi followed him. The woods were a blur of moss and bark. Kaito felt his throat burn with each running stride, desperate to catch his breath. There was only one place he knew the Kami would be safe, but he needed to get over the border first, and far from Jukai Forest. Tameshi and Aiko weren't far behind. He could hear his sister's footsteps and the rush of air each time Tameshi flew under a branch. The moonfolk could have left them at any time and soared back to Otawara without a second glance. But he didn't. He stayed by their sides like he was more friend than foe. Kaito decided that someday, if they made it out of the forest in one piece, he'd find a way to repay him. The ground rumbled, and Kaito froze in his tracks. "Please tell me that's another rock Kami," he said warily, watching the earth for movement. Aiko appeared on his left, face drained of color. A Kami exploded from the river, and the entire forest seemed to shudder in response. With an ear-splitting cry, the spirit tore past the trees, felling one of them with a mere slice of its bone-like arm. It moved in erratic bursts, long limbs stretched out like it was searching by touch. 2 orbs of unnatural green light glowed from a delicate stone face. But the carved smile it wore didn't match the anger radiating from its core. Frail as a skeleton, it had enough arms and legs to rival an insect, with heavy black cobwebs that fell over its crooked shape like a veil. Silk threads trailed one of its bony fingers, fixed to a paper lantern that swayed in front of its chest like a pendulum. Gravelighter. The Kami of Forgotten Clearings.
I'll try and talk to her,
Aiko murmured, almost too low for Kaito to hear. It's way too dangerous, Kaito started, but she pressed a hand against his forearm and then a finger to her lips. She wanted him to stay quiet. The Kami flashed toward them, head rotating at odd angles, searching for the sound as if her glowing eyes couldn't see anything at all. Aiko knelt, pinning her eyes to the ground.
I am Aiko Shizuki of the Imperial Palace, and a Kami diplomat.
The moment she spoke, the Kami slammed into the earth in front of her. Aiko's hair fluttered at the movement, but she didn't recoil.
It was not our intention to disturb you, nor do we mean to trespass in the forest any longer. We ask for safe passage to return to Boseiju.
Gravelighter cracked her stone mouth open, too wide to be anywhere near human, and all Kaito could see was a horrible, black void. The Kami stopped inches away from Aiko's bent neck, sensing her posture and her presence. When Gravelighter reared back too quickly, Kaito didn't know if she was going to leave or attack. He assumed the latter. "No!" Kaito shouted, bursting from his place in the grass and skidding in front of his sister. The Kami wailed, and Kaito squeezed the tanuki close to his chest and wrapped an arm around Aiko like he was protecting her. Like he was protecting them both. The Kami of Forgotten Clearings ripped through the trees, splitting branches and pummeling the earth, and raced straight for Kaito's exposed back. But before she landed her attack, the Tanuki Kami leapt from Kaito's arms and flew toward the larger spirit. Starlight exploded around them. Kaito squinted. He couldn't see what was happening. It was too bright, and both Kami were moving too fast. But it was enough time to pull Aiko to her feet and usher her toward Tameshi. "Go!" Kaito shouted. "I'll catch up!" Tameshi took Aiko by the waist and lifted her out of the way of splitting earth and flying stones, while Kaito ran back for the tanuki. He held up a hand, staring at the heart of the light in search of the small creature. And he saw her, flickering left and right, trying to distract Gravelighter. Except it only seemed to anger her. The Kami of Forgotten Clearings swung an arm back, preparing to swipe at the tanuki with all her strength, when Kaito leapt, grabbed hold of the smaller Kami, and rolled out of the way. With deadly force, the arm smashed into the forest floor, rattling the surrounding woodland. Kaito searched the tanuki's eyes, frantic. There was nowhere to flee. He wasn't fast enough, and he'd never in his life fought a Kami. He'd never even been trained for it. All he could do now was hold her close and brace for the next impact. But it didn't come. Kaito peeled his eyes apart and found Gravelighter staring at him with her strange marble face. She stretched her bone fingers closer, stopping inches from the tanuki's body. The tanuki let out a cry in response. No, not a cry. A command. The Gravelighter released a breath. The rumble made Kaito jerk backward. Then the Kami of Forgotten Clearings dove back into the river, water spraying in every direction, and vanished from sight. Kaito shivered, looking down at the small Kami still protected in his arms. I guess that means we can go? The Kami answered with a layered chirp, and Kaito got to his feet, wiped the river water from his forehead, and hurried to find his sister and Tameshi. The group reconnected near the border, to Aiko's visible relief.
You could have been killed!
She squeezed her arms around Kaito's neck, voice muffled. Between them, the Tanuki Kami gave a growl before jumping to the ground. Aiko pulled back and bowed apologetically.
Thank you. I think you may have saved our lives in the forest.
Kaito watched the Kami stretch her legs, golden orbs dancing in circles. Yeah, she's not the only one. They both turned to Tameshi.
You are going to give up your research to protect us,
Aiko said. Tameshi's eyes glinted. Do not look at me like I am a hero, because I am not. Most of my research is up here. He tapped the side of his head. And the rest of it, well, I never keep all of my research in one place. I was stalling, waiting for the Order of Jukai to turn up. I'm just glad they got my message in time. Kaito felt the shockwave, like a punch to the gut. You sent for them? Tameshi laughed. I am not going to set up a research lab in Jukai Forest without making sure I have security cameras. He shrugged. When I saw the two of you, I sent a drone to their temple. I figured you could all fight it out amongst each other while I got my equipment somewhere safe. Which, I'd like to point out, turned out to be an excellent idea. Kaito shook his head. And here I was trying to decide whether I liked you. Tameshi chuckled, and Kaito cracked a smile.
We are grateful for your help. But I still have a duty to report you to the Imperials,
Aiko said quietly.
When I do, there'll be a mark against your name. They'll keep a close eye on you, and anything you do for the rest of your life.
Tameshi waited. Unless? There was another long pause.
Unless you agree never to continue this research,
Aiko finished. For the rest of my life, huh? Tameshi pretended to weigh his options. Well, I do enjoy a challenge. Kaito snorted, and Aiko cast him a glance.
I know he sounds like you, but try to remember you're on my side.
Kaito lifted his shoulders. What? As far as team players go, he isn't the worst. Tameshi beamed. I appreciate the compliment. Aiko ignored their budding friendship and crossed her arms.
Do we have an agreement?
You don't need one. Tameshi sighed. I may have created a prototype to merge Kami and tech, but I wanted them to possess it of their own accord. It should be their choice. Aiko frowned.
No Kami would willingly sacrifice their freedom that way. It goes against their nature. Kami channelers are few and far between, but they exist because there's an exchange. Something shared. A Kami would have no reason to merge with a drone.
You're right. Which is why I have been searching for this little one. Tameshi nodded to the Tanuki. A Kami born in the mortal realm is a new phenomenon. I thought perhaps being born differently would lead her to react differently.
But she refused you,
Kaito acknowledged. When the Reckoners attacked, you tried to get her to merge with the tech, and she wouldn't. Not even to save herself.
Tameshi released a disappointed hum.
I am not one to easily admit defeat. He shook his head. But you don't need to be concerned with my research. Not without a willing Kami participant, which does not seem to exist. Aiko nodded.
Good.
Still, you are welcome to keep tabs on me. Tameshi winked. I cannot promise my next project will be entirely Imperial approved. Her lips curved.
Something tells me I'm going to regret you and my brother meeting today.
Tameshi pressed a panel on his belt, and his Tanuki drone flew down to Kaito.
Take it. It's far better than that outdated crane you've been holding on to.
Kaito's eyes widened. Are you sure?
You can buy me lunch when you come to Otawara, Tameshi replied. Katsumasa would love to see an old friend.
Thank you, Kaito said earnestly. He took the robot with both hands and flattened his lips to keep from smiling too wide.
I better clear what I can from my lab. It would be a shame for the Order of Jukai to destroy perfectly good equipment.
Tameshi glanced at the Kami.
Good luck out there. And thanks for the chase. It's been fun while it lasted.
They watched him disappear back into the forest, and it was Aiko who spoke first.
So, what now? She asked.
Well, now you take our new friend back to the palace with you, Kaito replied simply. Aiko pulled her face back.
To Iganjo?
Kaito shrugged.
If she really has a connection to the Emperor and Kyodai, then who better to watch over her than the great Kami herself?
On the ground, the Tanuki Kami was staring at them, listening intently. Kaito didn't particularly enjoy goodbyes, but he hadn't expected this one to tug at his chest so hard. He cleared his throat.
You should head to the train station before the order comes back.
Aiko stilled.
Where'll you go?
He knew her meaning. He wasn't exactly going to be welcome in the Undercity anytime soon. The Reckoners likely lost the fight. There was always a chance some of them fled. Kaito preferred if word about what happened didn't get back to Satoru, but it would be safest to lay low for a while, just in case. I'll be fine. Kaito grinned. Don't worry about me. Aiko pursed her lips.
You know what I think?
You've had way more fun here than you've ever had in Iganjo, Kaito offered. She made a face.
I think you never intended to give those schematics to Satoru. I think you asked for my help because you wanted to do the right thing. You're just too stubborn to admit it.
Kaito laughed. You still think there's an Imperial in me. But I promise, I'm an outlier through and through. Aiko looked down at the Tanuki.
It would be good if we had something to call her. A Kami this important deserves a formal introduction when we reach the palace.
Aren't you supposed to be an expert on Kami relations? Kaito pointed out. How do you usually find out their names?
It's not always that simple, she said. Sometimes it's through words or body language. Sometimes it's telepathic. But in some cases, you have to earn their trust before they'll properly communicate with you.
I vote we call her Pompon-chan for now, Kaito said. When the spirit let out a layered chirp, he grinned. See? She likes it. Aiko moved to pick up the Kami, but the Tanuki immediately leapt out of her reach. When Aiko took another step, the Kami scurried behind Kaito's feet for shelter. Don't worry, Kaito said. You'll be in good hands. My sister is one of the best people in Kamigawa. Just have to get past the frown lines. He took a step away, trying to encourage the Kami to go to Aiko, but the Kami released a frustrated howl and hid herself behind Kaito once again. Aiko lifted a brow.
I don't think she wants to go to the temple.
Well, she can't stay here alone. The Reckoners know about her. It's not safe, Kaito said. Aiko held back a laugh.
For someone who thinks they're so clever, you are terrible at seeing what's right in front of you.
Kaito blinked. But I don't understand. He shook his head at the Kami. I have nothing to offer you. No shelter or food,
I barely know what I'm doing half the time. He ran a hand through his hair. I just know that I need to find someone. Now, I'm not planning on stopping until I figure out how to bring her home. The Kami's eyes brightened. Aiko pressed a hand against Kaito's shoulder. Maybe that's exactly what she wants. Kaito leaned down in the grass, drone still wedged against his chest. You want to help look for the Emperor too? The Kami let out a sound that mimicked Kyodai's song, and Kaito recognized the relief behind the light. The sense of purpose. Maybe the Kami was never hiding in Jukai Forest. Maybe she was searching. Kaito nodded like he understood. Okay. I guess it's you and me from now on. Without warning, the Kami leapt for Kaito's chest and bonded herself to the Tanuki prototype. There was a flash of light and metal fluttering like 1,000,000,000,000 chrome hummingbirds. When the light eased, the Tanuki drone blinked from behind its glass eyes. It clambered up Kaito's arm till it found a place to rest on his shoulders. A noise trickled into his mind, steady at first and faint as a bell. But in the seconds that followed, the noise became an unmistakable chant. Kaito could hear it then. The Kami's name, echoing through his mind. When he turned to look at the Tanuki, she lowered her head, and a gentle understanding passed between the two of them. Her name, he said slowly. She says her name is Himoto. Kaito stood to face his sister, whose mouth was parted in fear. Tameshi's research. She tried to stop it. Tried to make sure it would never fall into the wrong hands. And now the proof of it was sitting on Kaito's shoulders like a beloved pet. The Tanuki robot shifted once more and drifted into Kaito's hands. When he turned it over, he realized it had morphed into a mask. He stared at the smooth edges and origami cutouts, wondering if a connection to the Emperor really did live inside Himoto, and if choosing to stay with Kaito meant anything at all. When he placed the Tanuki mask over his face, he felt it immediately. Energy thrummed in his core, all the way to his fingertips. It was like static and magic and power begging to be released. Begging for Kaito to let go. Somewhere behind him, Aiko was calling his name, shouting with desperate, terrified breaths. But Kaito couldn't answer her. Something was pulling his soul in another direction, to another plane, and he couldn't fight it. He didn't want to fight it. For the first time in years, Kaito felt as if he knew exactly where he was meant to go. The power burst through him, coursing through every bone and vein. Kaito let it consume him entirely, and when he felt the tug against his soul once more, he answered the call as if it had been fate all along. Kaito took a step forward and vanished from Kamigawa. The familiar smells of Tawashi made Kaito's mouth water. It had been a year since he'd tasted pork dumplings and curried rice. Not because he hadn't returned to Kamigawa, but because he hadn't stayed for very long. The Emperor was still out there, somewhere in the multiverse. He couldn't let street food distract him. When Himoto, the Kami of the Spark, turned Kaito into a Planeswalker, he knew it must have been for a reason. That somehow, the spirit realm had known Kaito was the only person on 100 planes who would never stop searching for her. He'd made a promise, after all. Kaito reached for his Tanuki mask and slid it over his face, shielding himself from the crowds. He'd always known how to make himself invisible. But these days, it was practically an art form. The multiverse had information he needed. And in Kaito's experience, it was always better when his enemy didn't see him coming. Kaito pulled up his collar and stepped onto the pavement, the city reflected in every puddle around him. He was a shadow among neon lights, who could disappear at a moment's notice. And he would, soon enough. But today, Kaito had a friend on Otawara who wanted to see him, and a sister in Iganjo who was waiting on news. And after that, there were many more planes to search.